Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and as much as I love a long-winded intro, I thought maybe today we'd just get straight into it. Why? Because I'm in a race against time to try and get as much of this voiceover finished before I collapse into another influenza-related sneezing fit. Winter's the best. On that note, I figured why not lean into the Winter Wonderland theme and make a big one-eyed winter Wendigo, or perhaps more accurately, DEERCLOPS. Now, I'm not a DEERCLOPS connoisseur, but I like to think of myself as a student of weird and wonderful monster amalgamations, so DEERCLOPS naturally holds a place in my heart. For those that don't know, DEERCLOPS is, well, it's a cyclops, but it's also a deer. More importantly, it's got a great big fluffy white body with little black deer-like appendages, which I'm making right now. Normally when I make a sculpture, I work my way from the bottom up, starting with the legs, then the torso, then the head, and finally the arms at the end. However, a new year is fast approaching, and I'm keen to try new things, so I figured why not start with the arms first. Also, I want the big fluffy white fur of the body to be overlapping the arms and legs, so I kinda have to make them first. I'm not insane though, so I'll leave the hands till last. Now, once I've made my furry black appendages, I can start to layer on the clay to build up DEERCLOPS' thick thoracic padding. He's also got a bit of a heart-shaped shape to his torso, so I'll form a line down his center and spread the fur to the sides before beginning the inferring process. Sculpting fur has always been a bit of a bittersweet experience for me, since I'm always bitter while I'm doing it, then when it's done I go, sweet, I don't have to do that for a while. I'm also never really sure what the best method for making the fur is, but I figured for this particular sculpture, I'd lean a little into the slightly cartoony look, so I'm gonna build up the little tapered blobs of clay that I'll then shape into shape before building up the next layer. Once I've covered DEERCLOPS' ample upper torso in a thick layer of white fur, I'll poke and prod each of the individual fur clumps with a variety of tools and add a little bit of hair-like texture. Finally, to smooth out the harsh tool marks and remove my fingerprints, I'll give the whole thing an exfoliating isopropyl alcohol scrub. Otherwise, that's kinda it for his body, which means I need to make his head. I'll start with another lump of white clay that I can poke and prod and twist and pull into a slightly oblong shape that vaguely resembles a low-poly deer skull with a hole for a mouth. I'll then build up the snout area before poking a great big divot to fit that single oversized eyeball. Then it's just a case of refining the overall shape of the head. The cheeks can get pulled back a bit and wrinkled up, then the eye can get some eyelids and wrinkles of its own before being attached to the body. I'll line up where on the torso the head should go, then carve out a head-sized hole to fit it all together. I'll then add a couple of ears to the side of DEERCLOPS' head because that's usually where ears go, and I can poke a couple divots between those ears to fit some long lengths of armature wire that can then be bent into antler-esque shapes. To make the rest of the antler, I'll wrap the first wire in some finer wire, then cover all the wire in a thin layer of appropriately antler-covered clay. Because I'm using flexible Cosclay, I can bake the clay now, then worry about the proper antler curves later. For now, I'll fill the mouth with a thin layer of pinkish mouth-colored clay, build up some big, beautiful DEERCLOPS lips, stick a pre-baked tongue in place, then start to fill in that gummy smile with a bunch of spooky, spiky DEERCLOPS teeth. I'm gonna try making DEERCLOPS' hands a little differently from normal, since I want them to be extra long and extra thin but still posable, since they're gonna be gripping some tree trunks. To that end, I'm gonna try some of this Flex Flow liquid clay. Basically, this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a liquid clay that becomes firm but flexible when it's baked, and you can tint it with basic acrylic paints. Now, it's not particularly easy to apply, but I figured for some spooky salad finger-esque hands, it's perfect. I'll coat the fingers in my tarry mixture and bake them once before attaching them to the stumps of DEERCLOPS' arms and blending them in with a bit more black clay. Finally, I'll fill the fingers out a tiny bit with some more liquid clay, and once he's been baked, that's DEERCLOPS all finished and flexible where it matters. All he needs now is some final detail and shading. I started by glazing all the white bits with a gray glaze in the hopes that this would add a bit of shading and color, but it was a bit too light in the end, so I repainted everything with a straight up black wash. Then, to bring back the white of the fur, I aggressively sponged the entire surface with several layers of white until the highest points were nice and bright, while the recesses were still black. I then cleaned up the black of the fur where I oversponged white, painted the horns with a couple coats of bone wash, and then applied several layers of lipstick like a 6-year-old child who got into their older sibling's makeup drawer. For the fur of the arms and legs, I'll apply a couple coats of progressively lighter gray dry brushings before painting his snoot black and adding some final white glazing strategically around the body to add a bit of contrast between the whites and blacks. Finally, I'll give his eye a little red rimming around the edge, then a great big black iris looking down, followed by an all black pupil in the center before coating the entire thing in a thick layer of UV resin. Otherwise, with the eyeball all gooped up, that's my DEERCLOPS finished, which means he needs something to fit those gnarly fingers around. And for that, I thought of making some trees. I kind of have an idea of how I want to make them, but I also don't really have any idea how I'm going to make them, so come along with me on this journey to make the jankiest trees on YouTube. First things first, I need to make a wire center for at least 2 trees, which I'll make by twisting some wire into a mega double wire. I'll then chop this wire down into a couple tree-sized lengths, then wrap those lengths in some thinner wire branches. In hindsight, I think my biggest issue with my future trees is that I didn't have nearly enough branches, and the branches I did use were far too thick. If I end up making more trees in a future video, I'm definitely going to make a hell of a lot more skinnier branches. For now though, I need to coat this tree in some hot glue to hide the double helix wire, then I'll paint the entire thing in a mix of brown paint and flexible paste to give it some texture, followed by a lighter brown dry brushing. I'll then coat each of the branches in a layer of PVA glue before applying some static grass over top. As it turns out, I didn't actually need to staticatize the grass since you just straight up drop it on the branch to get the exact same results. I want my branches bent, so I'll bend my branches, then I'm ready to add the next layer of greenery in the form of tiny foam flock. Once that's been applied, I can set it aside to dry and admire my next level botany skills. Now, if I told you I was going for baby's first monkey puzzle tree, then I'd say I pretty much nailed it. That being said, I needed to make a few more trees, and by the 8th and final iteration, I was getting pretty halfway decent looking eastern hemlocks. Last but not least then, I need to make something for DEERCLOPS to eat. In the interest of not having to make a teeny tiny 5mm tall person, I'm just gonna make a tent and say that this takes place at night and everyone's asleep. Now to make my teeny tiny tent, I made a teeny tiny foam form that I can then cover in some little strips of canvas. I did try making a proper tent several times before realizing that no one's ever going to see inside this tent, so why am I making it so much harder for myself? So instead I made a foam form, covered it in canvas, and painted it with glue to harden up the walls. Then I stuck some wire to the underside so I can wrap some teeny tiny threads of twine around the various bits before painting it leathery brown. And with that, I've got an excellent looking little tent ready to be crushed by DEERCLOPS. All that's left to do then is make my winter base, which I'll make out of this inexplicably ugly looking sheet of foam. Before I cover my base in snow though, I want to make sure all the pieces fit in place and figure out where everything's gonna go. I'll bend my 2 wire-filled trees and fit them in underneath DEERCLOPS' hand so it looks like he's pressed the trees to the side to look down on our hapless victims. Then I can fit the rest of the trees in place on the base. I thought it might be fun to have a little campfire in the clearing by the tent, casting light up into DEERCLOPS' solitary eyeball, so I cut a little hole in the foam and fit one of those flickering tea lights into the space. Then it was time to add the snow, so I'll paint the rim of the base black and crack out my favorite non-sponsored product, One Strike Filler. This stuff is fluffy white hole filler and is perfect for snow, except, as it turns out, I ain't got much left, so I'm gonna have to make what's here last. I'll cover the whole base in as thick a layer of hole filler as I can manage, then smooth it out with a water-dampened finger. I also decided that that little tea light's a bit too big and a bit too weak for what I want to achieve, so I'll just pull the whole thing out and cover up the spot with some more hole filler. Finally, I can fit my pieces back onto the base. Now, originally I wanted some bigger drifts of snow between the trees, but I ran out of hole filler, so instead I'll cover some of the empty spaces with little bushes sprinkled with white flocking. I can then fit the rest of the trees in place around the base and sprinkle lots of snowy white flocking over the tops until everything is lightly dusted in snow. Finally, I'll fit my teeny tiny tent into the clearing in the front and sprinkle some snow on top, then using the back end of a toothpick, I'll poke some footprints into the snow in front of the tent and around the clearing. I'll then poke a little divot into the snow, then line it with rocks to make my non-tea light lit campfire. And with that, we're all done here and on to the glamour shots. As always, a big old thank you to my wonderful patrons of Patreon, and a special hey how are you to the newest of them: Cetera, Megana, Moctopus, Undead Chaos Pixie, Desia, Joe Schnee, Sean P. Kelly, November Ocean, Starboy, The Worm, Catherine Mobley, Darth Pratus, and Kevin. You are the little food-filled canvas tent that keeps this DEERCLOPS of a channel fed. It's the winter season out there, so don't forget to drink lots of water and take your vitamin D. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.